focus our attention this morning, it was a couple of years ago. I don't remember exactly which year, but it was before COVID. I know that, and not long after I had moved here, I learned a few things about, different individuals in the congregation, some who have different interests. And there's one person that I can always count on to give me interesting facts about historical places or things of that nature, places of interest that you might need to check out. And Philip Marks is that guy. If you want to know anything interesting about Lauderdale County or something close, ask Philip to send you to a place. And this particular conversation was geared around a place in Florence known as the Forks of Cyprus. Many of you may have seen the big mansion when it existed. I've only seen the remains of it, but I was interested to see how it was built and the property on which it lies. And interestingly enough, there's a cemetery, many of you may know, not far from the remains of that place where the family, the Jackson family, who constructed this mansion, the Forks of Cyprus, where their family is buried. And of interest, there are two headstones in that cemetery that have great inscriptions on them. James Jackson, the patriarch of the family and the one who constructed the mansion, he has a lot of words on his headstone. I mean, there's pretty much all of his virtues that he possessed in his life. It's just a big ornate headstone with all of these words listed about him. And then interestingly enough, his son, William Jackson, who has 5 words on his headstone, and they are a man of unquestioned integrity. Now, I don't know much about William Jackson. I couldn't really find a whole lot of information about him, but I always thought that was pretty interesting, that if you could summarize a man's life in any way, those 5 words could be as powerful of an epitaph as you could ever read in your whole life. A man of unquestioned integrity. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, what Paul does to the church at Thessalonica is explain to them why it was important for him to be a person of integrity. And he's already done that. He's built a foundation of it anyway, because back in Acts 17, which Jonathan read for us a few moments ago, you see that Paul and Silas left Philippi and they were making their way into Thessalonica, and their experiences in Philippi were not pleasant. They were imprisoned, they were beaten, they were, ridiculed for their faith in Jesus Christ. And so they're really forced out of Philippi because the people there were afraid that there was going to be more civil unrest because Paul and Silas were preaching Jesus. And so they make them leave. And as they make their way into Thessalonica, which we read in Acts 17, 1 through 10, you see that they didn't really receive a warm welcome there either. That people were upset that they too were preaching Jesus in Thessalonica, even to the point where they forced Jason and his household out into the city square, and they're persecuting Jason just because they think Christians are hiding in his house. I mean, it was a bad situation. And so what Paul and Silas endure when they come to Thessalonica, and you could almost say the climate in which the church in Thessalonica existed, demanded those Christians to live with unquestioned integrity. That if they were going to progress the gospel at all, if they were going to model what the gospel looks like or how Jesus had made a change in their lives, then undoubtedly they were going to have to be people of integrity. And I see in 1 Thessalonians and Paul's plea to the church there about being in people of integrity, I see parallels, a lot of parallels between the church at Thessalonica and the demand for integrity and our response to our culture today. And so I would like to center our thoughts this morning around this idea of unquestioned integrity from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. There's a definition that I found, a guy that I like to read, Warren Wiersbe. He's a commentator, and the reason I like to read him is because he alliterates all of his points, and so it's easy to understand, easy to follow, and easy to remember. But in his book, The Integrity Crisis, Warren Wiersbe says this about integrity. He says, integrity is to personal or corporate character what health is to the body or 20/20 vision is to the eyes. A person with integrity is not divided, that's duplicity, or merely pretending, that's hypocrisy. He or she is whole. Life is put together and things are working harmoniously. People with integrity have nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Their lives are open books. And almost every definition that I could find, you could really see two words that were repetitive, and those were whole and complete. And it's the idea of really just life is together for these people. People that modeled integrity had their lives together, that they had nothing to hide, as Mr. Wiersbe says, that they are like an open book, that when they were examined or when people looked at what they were doing or how they acted or how they existed, then they really just saw everything laid bare. Truth be told, I guess you could say, what we lack today is integrity. Or there is an integrity crisis today. There are not a lot of people that are okay with living their lives as an open book. There are not a lot of people that are okay with admitting, or maybe they can't admit, that their lives feel complete or whole or put together, that there are pieces that are missing and lacking. Not because it's not there for the taking, maybe because we just don't have a backbone, really. And so what I think we see maybe in some of these definitions, or maybe this idea from Mr. Wiersbe, is some definite areas in which we could be convicted, maybe individually you could be convicted to be more of a person of integrity, to decide, I'm going to be put together. I'm going to be whole and complete is the idea. Or maybe collectively as a church, we could be people of integrity. And I think Paul challenges the church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 6. And I know this, that only people of integrity stand the test of time. The people that don't have integrity, they fade away. They cave under pressure. They crumble when life gets hard. They crumble when people press in against them. When there's a little bit of opposition or when there's a little bit of persecution, they fold. They fall down. Only people with integrity stand the test of time. And I think Paul and Silas teach that pretty clearly. In Acts 17 and verse 6, when Jonathan read for us, it said that Paul and Silas turned the world upside down. They only did it because they were people of integrity. What do we learn about Paul and Silas that might help us in our culture today? 4 things I want to point out to you. Here's number 1. They taught and lived the gospel in spite of strong opposition. You look right there at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Really, chapter 1 is just sort of an introduction, like most are, to Paul's material, in which he says things like this: you have done a great job of living out your faith, and you are facing some strong opposition. The gospel that we gave to you, it's sufficient, it's good. The Holy Spirit inspired us to tell you this. Believe it and live it. And then in chapter 2, in verse number 1, Paul says this: for you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result, that we were successful when we came to you, even though it doesn't look like that, because we were met with opposition and persecution and people that wanted to, completely stop the progress of the gospel. You don't worry about that. Our visit was successful. Look at verse 2. On the contrary, even after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. I've heard it said before that the door of opportunity swings on the hinges of opposition. And I think that's what Paul is trying to communicate to the church at Thessalonica here. This door was open to us. It was a massive door of opportunity, but it didn't come without any opposition. And don't be fooled. This opposition, it didn't stop us at all. It didn't make us not want to do this anymore. It didn't make us question our decision. It didn't make us think, is this really worth what we're doing? It meant something to them. And even in the face of strong opposition, Paul and Silas were committed to preaching the gospel. And he found that to be true, that there was strong opposition to his position in embracing the gospel of Jesus Christ. He mentions it right here in our text, what he faced in Philippi, the being in prison and the being beaten and the being ridiculed and the being cast out of town. All of that's true. Look at Acts 16, and that's the parallel. And then you get to Acts 17, verses 1 through 10, and you see that they received the same kind of welcome in Thessalonica, and he even says that right here in verse number 2. We were still bold, and we were made bold by God to speak the gospel to you, even here in Thessalonica, in the face of strong opposition. I love that response that Paul gives to that opposition, or to that indifference, or to that rejection, basically, right there in verse number 2. And you and I both know that living out the gospel, embracing Jesus and His will for our lives and living that out, whether it's by the things that we say or by the things that we do, which is why I put both of those words up there. They taught it and lived it. Because it wasn't just things that they said. Obviously, in order for them to endure the physical persecution that they did, they were committing to living it. It wasn't just saying it either. And so when he says we were made bold by God to speak the gospel to you, I think included in that or implicit in that is Paul's commitment to living it out physically too, because it would have been easy for him to not do that after all of the physical persecution and opposition. And so we know that living out the gospel, even in our world, and we seem to think, well, all of the persecution for Christianity, it's over there. It's across the pond. It's not here, in our country. It's not right here in our backyard. So we're not really worried about persecution or opposition. And that's not necessarily true anymore. And we know very well, hey, if I'm going to live out the gospel, then it's not popular. It's rarely popular anymore to live out the gospel or to embrace Jesus and what Jesus teaches. For every person that receives you gladly, there's going to be a lot more that reject you gladly. And that's just the reality of the culture in which we live. They're just turning hostile. Maybe it's because they can't trust anybody. There's an integrity crisis, and nobody knows who they can trust anymore. You can't trust your leaders. You can't trust your friend. You can't trust the people in church. You can't trust the sign on the bathroom door. You can't trust anybody. There's an integrity crisis, and people are just confused, and they don't know what to do, right? If now more than ever, we need people that'll teach and live the gospel. It doesn't matter what we face, right? It doesn't matter what opposition comes our way. And I like Paul's response to that because he didn't change his message. He didn't back down. He said, hey, we were made bold by God to stand up and just preach Jesus. John 15 and verse 18, Jesus warned. He said, if the world hates you, just remember that they hated me first. And Jesus told us really that's how it was going to be. And if I'm doing this Jesus thing right, this Christianity thing right, then those words are going to come true for me sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. What should I do if I meet opposition or indifference while I'm teaching or living the gospel? While I'm making it my life, I should refuse to be intimidated. Refuse to be intimidated. I should pray and keep doing what I'm doing. Sometimes that's the best thing to do. To keep doing what you're doing, to be right, to keep doing what you're doing that is right. I know sometimes we do right and we wonder, what's it all for, right? I'm not being rewarded. Nothing good is coming from me being a Christian because it seems like everybody that's not a Christian is living a better life than me. And they're getting more and it seems like they're happier. Why would I keep doing this? Keep doing right. Sooner or later it will pay off. Someone said the real measure of a person is what it'll take to stop you. What will it take to stop you from being a Christian? I know that we all want to live the gospel and we all want to teach the gospel and we all want to make an impact. We want people to come to Jesus because of our lives and the things that we say. The people who make the biggest impact, rely so heavily on God that nothing can stop them. They teach and live the gospel. Here's thing number 2 that made Paul and Silas people of integrity. And I think why Paul was trying to make the church strong in the face of opposition. Here's what Paul says in the second place. He said, we just told the truth. Now sometimes I want to preface everything I'm about to say by saying this. Sometimes people do a lot of damage in the name of truth, right? You know that they would, I'm just telling the truth. And they forget about what Paul says in Ephesians 4 and verse 15 about speaking the truth in love. And even told the church at Galatia, let your speech always be with grace, right? Seasoned with salt. That there's this element of presenting the truth in such a way that does convict. The truth will set you free, we say, but it has to hurt you first. There's something convicting about truth, but sometimes we view that in, I've got to hit them in the face with it, right? That's what we say sometimes. Or we'll jam it down their throats because that's what we have to do. And we don't care about their feelings and we don't care about emotions and we don't care about their hearts because we just have to tell the truth. And that's all that matters. You just have to be a jerk about the truth. Nobody's ever been won to Jesus by you being a jerk with the truth. But I do know this, that Paul was emphatically clear about the fact that they told the truth. That they weren't just making up things to get people to follow Jesus. Neither were they so concerned about the emotions and the feelings of those people that they were willing to twist and change it a little bit just to get people on their sides. They told the truth. Look at verse number 3. For our exhortation didn't come from error. It didn't come from impurity. It didn't come from an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God who examines our hearts. Now, if you look at verse number 3 and even into verse number 4, there's really four things that Paul's saying about this element of truth. Number one, he says, we were honest. We were honest. It wasn't trying to deceive you. He says, number two, it's pure. It's not from impurity. And maybe there was a little bit of an allusion to sexual immorality because that was massive in Thessalonica as it was in most first century churches. And so maybe he's saying we're not using the gospel as a cover to do anything that we want to. Maybe he says that the gospel is true. It's not from error. In other words, what Paul says is you can trust what we're saying. Our message is trustworthy. That it didn't come from us, it came from God. We have been entrusted and approved by God to tell you this message, and that's a high honor. But a person who's been entrusted with the message of Jesus Christ, as high and sacred of an honor as it is, it demands moral integrity. It demands spiritual integrity, and that's what Paul says. We have been entrusted with God's message, and we're not coming to you because we want you to just be on our side. And we're not coming to you because we made this up and we think it's a good message. This is God's message, and we want to tell you the truth. He says in verse number 4, in verse number 3, this exhortation, when it came from not from error or not from impurity or not from this intention to deceive. Some of your Bibles might say something along the lines of trickery, not from trickery. It's kind of the word we use, or the Greek word, it gives itself to our English definition, something like baiting the hook, right? You're trying to entice a fish to bite the hook that you throw out in the water, and so you put some sort of bait that's attractive on it to them, and that's what Paul essentially says. We weren't doing that with this message. We weren't just throwing it out there with this nice-looking bait that would entice you to grab it. There's no impure motives here. There's no ulterior motives. We just want to tell you the truth. We just want you to know what you're getting into. Now, we think about our world, and obviously we've talked a little bit about it already. It's in trouble. I mean, it is. It's not just our country. It's our world. The world is in trouble. There's sin everywhere, obviously. And we know the detriment of sin because we look at people that we care about, even in our own hometowns, and we see the detriment of sin. And then we broaden our scope to our state or our country or our world, and we just see then the impact and the detriment of sin and all of the things that it's causing. No one's getting along. No one can trust anybody. As we've already said, that's what happens when nobody tells the truth. That's what happens when there's no integrity. That's what happens when nobody will stand up or put their foot down. And Paul says, here's what we had to do. In the face of opposition, we lived the gospel, but we told the truth. We told the truth, whether we like it or not. And this is the hard part for me. Unbelievers see when we don't tell the truth. And they see when we don't live the gospel too. You look at the number one reason, well, maybe number two reasons why unbelievers or unchurched people refuse to go to church. Surveys will tell you that there's two reasons. Number one, because they think the church just wants money, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But number two, they think that all the people that make up the church, they're just fake. They're just fake. They say one thing and they live another, and nobody wants to be a part of that because the people that make up the churches, the general public says they have no integrity. They're not put together. They don't tell the truth. They say one thing and they don't do another. That's alarming to me. That's alarming to me. They tell the truth. That's what Paul did. Here's number 3. They were genuine. They were genuine. How did Paul and Silas turn the world upside down? What did their integrity demand in their lives? They lived the gospel. They taught the truth. They were genuine. Look at verse number 5. We never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. Paul is mentioning several methods that he used to reach people. Obviously, verse 3 and verse 4 talk about some of the methods, except you'll see that they're always in the negative. We didn't do it from error. We didn't do it to deceive. We didn't do it to trick. We didn't do it from impurity. Verse 5, we didn't do it using flattering speech, and we didn't do it out of greedy motives. And so all of these things are negative, but here's what he says. Basically, when we're talking about being genuine, there's two things Paul points out in verse number 5. Number 1, he says we didn't use flattery, essentially. And number 2, he says we didn't put on a mask. We didn't put on a mask to cover up our greed. And I think that greed is in the context for a particular reason, which we'll note, but I think that idea of masking things up, it's all the more relevant in our own lives in more ways than just masking our greed. We're really good at putting on masks in our culture. What does Paul mean, I guess, when he says we didn't use flattery? How does that translate to being a genuine person? I looked up some of the definitions of flattery, and I was surprised to find out that it was a little bit of a different take than what I just always thought the word flattery meant. I mean, I feel like I guess I was right on line, but there was more to it than what I had always thought about it. Here were some of the definitions of flattery. It says to make a favorable impression for a selfish purpose. One definition says it touches areas such as insincere compliments, praise given that you don't mean, emotional manipulation, and insincerity as a matter of policy. And I was thinking about that in terms of Paul and what Paul was trying to emphasize to the church at Thessalonica, and by extension, the things that the church of Thessalonica would do in evangelizing their culture. Paul was a genuine dude. He was a straight shooter, as we say. What you see with Paul is what you get. And he said what he meant and meant what he said. And that's what he's telling them in verse number 5. When he says, we're not using flattery. I'm not trying to give you praise and make you think you're better than. I'm just trying to tell you how it is. And that's all it is. I just want you to see the gospel for what it is. And then he says in verse number 5 that we didn't have greedy motives. The Greek word, it breaks down into this root of putting on a mask, which is why I mentioned that. You know, actors put on a mask to cover up their real identity or their real intentions, and we do that a lot spiritually speaking. We put on these masks or these robes or these costumes or these, cover-ups basically to hide our true intentions or to try to hide our real identity, and it just doesn't work. People that do that, they try to say things and they try to do things that appear spiritual, and they try to say things and do things that appear generous, and they try to say things and do things that appear kind, all the while they realize that they're not exactly what they claim to be. Or maybe they're doing all of that, saying kind and generous things, or maybe they're saying or doing spiritual things because it brings them some sort of personal gain or personal advantage, that their motives are just not clear. They're putting on a mask or a costume in order to gain something. They have ulterior or improper motives. I told you just a minute ago the two top results that surveys indicate people won't come to church. I told you that one of them was because they think people are just fake, that there's no integrity, that they can't believe that the people there are actually true, that they say one thing and do another. And I mentioned too the other one, that people just think that the church wants money. And that's not a new issue. That's not just something people in America have dreamed up because mega churches have become a thing and people preach on TV and tell them that if they'll just, send them $20, then God will give them an airplane, all that kind of stuff. That didn't just come up with all these TV guys. Obviously, it was a problem for Paul too. People just thought that Paul was coming in there just to get money from them, just so he could keep up with his world tour, so he could see all these famous 7 wonders of the world. He wasn't really preaching the gospel. He was just using that as a cover to go on vacation. And that's what they thought. Paul was just coming in their town saying, Paul says, listen, I'm not coming to you for that reason. And you're going to have to help everybody see that the gospel, when it's presented, it's not for that reason. That there's something more valuable than money at stake here. We didn't come to you because we were trying to mask something or cover something. And you know what Paul's answer to them was? His answer to them, when they would question whether his motives are true or not, his answer, and you see this right here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 6. His answer is basically this. Come and see. Just take a look at our lives. Just look at how we live. Look at what we're saying and look at what we're doing. Let me ask you a question before we move on to number 4. Do you feel comfortable doing that? Do you feel comfortable doing that? That's a question I'm struggling with. I don't know if I would. I need to do better at that. I need to work hard to be a person of integrity that teaches and lives the gospel, that speaks the truth, obviously, but then works on the being genuine. That sometimes it's really easy, I guess just because that's how our culture has conditioned us to be, that we mask so many things. And we try to hide so much stuff, that we're not just good and genuine folks that have a way of communicating the gospel that's easy to see. That we could easily say, I'm not doing this for impure motives. I'm not doing this for personal gain. Just look at my life and see Jesus. I got to do better at that. being a person of integrity. Here's number 4. This is what Paul says. I'm not here to please anybody. I just want to please God. God is all that matters to me, is essentially what he communicates. I'm not doing this so that you'll tell me I did a good job, and I'm not doing this so you'll follow us. I'm not doing this so you'll give me money. I'm doing this because I want to make God happy. Look what he says in verse number 6. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. And he even mentions earlier in verse number 4 that he's speaking to please God, not to please people. I like in verse number 6 where it says, and we didn't seek glory. The Greek indicates an earnest seeking, an intentional pursuit of God's glory. An intentional decision that they weren't going to let anybody else's opinions or thoughts impact them or determine their decisions, that they were wholeheartedly going to give their lives to God, that everything that they did, everything that motivated them, everything that drives their life was fueled by God, and nothing else was doing that. And I think that's the key. What makes them act as people of integrity and not out of impure motives? What makes them act and tell the truth in spite of opposition? What makes them be genuine people when everyone else is in the business of masking all of their impurities? What makes them act this way? Above all, they just wanted to please God. It didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. It wasn't pleasing the person beside them. It wasn't pleasing the person across the aisle from them. It wasn't pleasing the person that ran their company. It wasn't pleasing their teachers. It wasn't pleasing their mom and dad. Now, children, please your mom and dad, but that wasn't the most important thing to them. The most important thing is God happy with me? And if God is happy with you, then you'll please your mom and dad. If God is happy with you, you'll please your teachers and you'll please your employees. If you don't, their heart's wrong, not yours. Please God more than anything in the world. Paul, how could you stand in the face of opposition? How could you tell the truth without wavering? How could you be genuine when everybody else is being fake? Because God mattered more to me. Let me give you a couple of differences really quick between men pleasers and God pleasers. How I know the difference between the two and how you can tell them too, how you can see them clearly. Because man pleasers, they refuse to speak the truth. They refuse to speak hard truths. They won't put their foot down on anything. They're always flip-flopping. Don't you know a lot of people like that today? And that's the church, really. I mean, the church is becoming that way because we just want to make people happy and get people on our sides. And so we can't have a hard stance on anything. God forbid you stand up for the truth on anything, because then people will get upset and they'll just leave. Man pleasers, they do that. But God pleasers, they're willing to speak the truth. Man pleasers, they say what people want to hear, right? God pleasers, according to 1 Thessalonians 2:1-6, they say what people need to hear. Man pleasers, they flip-flop on crucial issues. They're constantly going back and forth. God pleasers, they're consistent all the time. They stay the course. Man pleasers, they obey when it's convenient, right? When it's easy for them to do that, or when it benefits them in some way. God pleasers, they obey no matter what. Man pleasers, they tell the truth some of the time. God pleasers tell the truth all the time. You hear that analogy of the doctor, right? You go to the doctor and you don't want to tell him, you don't want him to say, well, here's a little bit of what. You just want him to tell you the truth. As much as it might hurt, you want to know, because it's a matter of life and death for your physical body. And you want that doctor to tell you the truth. And we always say that's the same thing about spiritual truth too. We don't want somebody to tell us the half-truth. We don't want somebody to sugarcoat the truth and make us think that we have false hope. We just want them to tell us the truth. So we know, because it's a matter of life or death. Christians must be people who hold themselves and others to the highest standard of integrity. I want to share with you a quote that I found from Abraham Lincoln I thought was pretty interesting. I've always enjoyed autobiographies and biographies even. I like to learn about people and read about people, and really there's always good sermon material in autobiographies and biographies. There was a quote that Abraham Lincoln had said, and I thought it was pretty interesting. He says, if I were to try to read, much less answer, all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what's said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10,000 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. And I thought about that quote and how that may have shed some light into Paul's decision to be faithful to God. And I think about how Paul's decision to be faithful to God was the most incredible and impactful decision ever made, but it was made with this thought in mind. I don't care what people say about me. I'm going to give myself to God, and God's going to bring me out all right. And if at the end I'm all right, that's okay. And if I'm wrong, then it really doesn't matter what anybody else says. I'm right or I'm right. I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Paul's commitment to God was that of faithfulness. It was that of intentional pursuit, and it was that of dedication. I'm going to hang in there. I'm going to stick in there. I'm going to stand my ground. I'm not going to back down. I'm going to plant my feet firmly on the truth, and I'm going to live to please the Lord. And it won't matter what anybody else says about me. I'm not worried about what anybody else says about me, about what I'm doing, about my life, and how crazy it seems. I'm going to please the Lord. I'm going to give myself to the Lord. Maybe this morning you're here and you've not committed yourself to the Lord. Maybe it is the case that you're not a person. Actually, it's no question at all. You're not a person of integrity. You flip-flop on crucial issues. You can't tell the truth. You really have no backbone. You're not a genuine person at all. You have a tendency to mask everything. Maybe you're not all of those things together, but maybe there's one of them that's holding you back from giving yourself to God as wholly as you would like, as completely as you would like, and as He would like for you to pursue Him. Maybe there's something holding you back. Let it not be said of you this morning that you're not a person of integrity. If there's ever a time for the church to be people of integrity, it's right now. Make that decision this morning to follow Jesus, to obey the gospel, to give your life to Him, to say, you know what, I'm going to pursue God no matter what. What matters to me more than anything is whether or not the Lord is happy with me, and that fuels every decision you'll ever make in your life. Obey the gospel, be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins. Have a new life, a new start, a new opportunity to serve God. Maybe you are a Christian, and maybe this unquestioned integrity, when people look at your lives, they don't see that at all. Let's make a change today. Let's commit to being better people for the glory of God. If we can help you in any way, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.